The Friends of the East-West Center welcomes its members, the East-West Center community, and those of you joining China Seminar for the first time. We have the privilege today of having as our speaker one of the most distinguished young scholars in Chinese foreign policy. Shuxian Luo is currently an assistant professor of Asian Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa and a non-resident China fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Among her many academic accomplishments, she was a postdoctoral research fellow in foreign policy program at the Brookings Institution and an adjunct lecturer at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, where she received her doctorate in international relations. Her research projects include looking at Sino-Russian relations in the Indo-Pacific. She is a tireless researcher and, in fact, comes to us today from Manila, where she is now doing field work. Dr. Luo, welcome to China Seminar. The floor is now yours.
Thank you, Jero. Thank you for the very kind introduction, and good afternoon, everyone who in Hawaii, and good morning to those of you who are in other parts of the world. And thank you for having me today. Let me share my screen. Right, so today my talk will cover a working paper that I just finished as part of my project at the Wilson Center, because in the current academic year, I'm also a non-resident China fellow at the center. So this study is the more theoretical component that I completed for that project. So I look at China's bifurcated approach toward Russia in China's territorial disputes with India and Vietnam, and I analyze this topic through the framework of wedging and binding. Although I tried to find a picture which featured Xi Jinping, Putin, and Nguyen Phu Trong, the Vietnam leader, but I didn't find one which somehow I would argue supported my conclusion in this study. So start off with a central research question that made me want to do this study is there have been a lot of discussions, commentaries in newspaper, in media these days, talking about, especially since the start of the war in Ukraine, that talking about Russia becoming China's vassal state, so to speak, or a junior partner, and also some commentary will go as far as to argue to predict that Beijing will leverage its growing influence over Moscow to gain stronger support from Russia in China's territorial disputes with India and Vietnam, both of which are longstanding partners of Moscow, dated all the way back to early Cold War years. So I kind of wondering, as I read all these commentaries, are this really necessarily the case? So I did a little bit of research, and bottom line up front, as I usually say in my presentation, I want to summarize my core findings and argument in the first place. Firstly, in the post-Cold War era, I would argue China has adopted a bifurcated approach toward Russia in the context of its territorial disputes with India and Vietnam. To be more specific, driven by a logic of what I would call indirect wedging, China has consistently refrained from pressuring for Russia's support in its dispute with India. But by contrast, driven by a logic of binding, China has been less reluctant to pressure Moscow to align its position with China's on maritime disputes with Vietnam. And to do this, to assemble the empirical evidence, I derive from primary sources, including leadership speeches, archived documents, analyses by Chinese think tank experts and scholars, called corporate yearbooks, media reports, and also utilize the CIPRI database on the international arms trade, as well as the CSIS China-Russian joint military exercises to assemble my empirical cases. But let me first elaborate on my analytical framework, the wedging and binding literature. So in the existing literature, wedging is defined as a state's attempt to forestall, to weaken, or break up threatening alignment at an acceptable cost as laid out in scholars' work like Tim Crawford and Izumikawa. And to be more, wedging comprises of two primary types of wedging methods. So one is to be more accommodative, so to engage in selective accommodation by provides economic or political or other kind of carrots to induce this kind of wedging to drive a wedge between the target and the primary adversary state. And also, the divider can engage in confrontational wedging by exerting pressure on the alignment or alliance, and thereby to expose, difference in interest between the target state and the primary adversary state. But what is not addressed in the existing literature is a divider that lacks reward power, and at the same time, confrontational wedging clearly carries a high risk of blowback. Of course, the existing literature talks about the risk of blowback. That's why states tend to opt for selective accommodation more often instead of using coercive wedging. But it doesn't really touch on the question of for a divider that facing deficiency in both regards, that lacks both doesn't have enough reward power to engaging in to buy over the divider or to provide a selective accommodation, and also cannot engage in confrontational wedging because it knows clearly that such a strategy would backfire. So under this circumstance, I would argue that the divider would engage in a third type of strategy, what I call is indirect wedging. By engaging in indirect wedging, the divider may utilize a collaborator state which shares the same primary adversary. So in this China-Russia United States case, obviously it's Russia and shares the same primary adversary, that is the United States, and share the same the collaborator and divider share the same goal of neutralizing the target. So in this case, it will be India, but possesses more reward power to engage in selective accommodation. But for the divider, indirect wedging comes with several major drawbacks, including, because the divider doesn't engage in direct wedging, so it has limited or no control over the benefits offered by the collaborator to the target. And also the benefits that the target states have from those benefits from those accommodation might strengthen the target's position in potential conflicts with the divider going forward. And also, divider may need to even help the collaborator to make some accommodation to help sweeten the deal, to make the deal more attractive to the target. Now switch back to the concept of binding. So binding is defined as a state's attempt to maintain or enhance alignment with security partners targeted by another country, by another state's wedge strategies. So it goes a three-way, right? You have a divider and you have a target and a binder. So the divider tried to drive a wedge between the binder and target, whereas the binder tried to keep the target on its side by engaging in kind of a counter strategy against wedging. So now that we're a little bit into the empirical cases, in Russia in the Sino-Indian territorial disputes, where I find China has been a weak divider in its goal of preventing India from leaning toward the United States. So in terms of accommodative wedging to provide selective accommodation, to be more specific, China lacks the political reward power with India because in the past China has settled most of its land border disputes with its neighboring countries, but in most cases China had made a compromise. But this didn't work in the Sino-Indian territorial dispute because China and India takes their approach so far had been irreconcilable. Because China has at some point offered starting in 1960s until 1980s have been insisting on what is known as a package deal, meaning that there are two blocks, there are two sectors, two major sectors that is at dispute: the eastern sector, Arunachal Pradesh, which is controlled by India, and Aksai Chin, the western sector, which is controlled by China. So the pact deal basically offers India to keep the eastern sector of Arunachal Pradesh, but allows China to keep the Aksai Chin, the western sector. But for India, this proposal is not acceptable. India insists on a sector by sector approach, but for the sector, but China's response to the sector by sector approach is okay, but then let's negotiate on both eastern sector and western sector. But from India's perspective, the Arunachal Pradesh, the eastern sector, is not open for negotiation. So again, that sector by sector approach still sees the Chinese and Indian position as incompatible. So it doesn't work that China might settle this kind of dispute by offering some territorial compromise or concession to India. So that doesn't work. What about the economic power? So you might think that as the world's second largest economy nowadays, China might have sufficient economic reward power as it does with many other neighboring countries that you might recall. Countries still at maritime disputes with China in the South China Sea. But in the case of India and China territorial disputes, China still lacked economic reward power. Because if we look at the data, China ranked only the 20th as India's major source of FDI as of 2021. So China doesn't have much leverage with respect to direct investment in India. And also, India has been resistant on China-led economic initiatives such as the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, and RCEP, the regional comprehensive economic partnerships, etc. And furthermore, India has placed restrictions and called for boycotting of Chinese products as relationship become more tense after the 2017 Doklam standoff, and more so after the 2020 deadly clash between the two countries' border troops in Galwan Valley. And also, what reinforces India's position is India has a more attractive alternatives. Think about its good relationship with the United States, Japan, and other U.S. allies and partners in this region. And on the coercive side, coercive wedging obviously carries a high risk of blowback. We think about 2017, 2020, as I mentioned, that pushed India to further embrace the Quad with greater enthusiasm. And so under this circumstance, Russia stands out as a viable, although at some point, from time to time, unpleasant collaborator for China in neutralizing India. Because, like I said, Russia shares the same primary adversary as China, that is the United States, and also share the same goal as China in preventing India from aligning more closely with the United States. But one thing different is Russia possesses more reward power vis-a-vis India, especially in terms of defense cooperation. So in this case, China's approach toward Russia is what I would call choosing the lesser of two evils. That is to tolerate. China has been tolerating Russia's pursuit of self-interest in Sino-Indian border dispute, Sino-Indian relations that even sometimes would come at the expense of China's secondary national interest. So if we look at the whole post-Cold War period, China's behavior China's approach toward Russia's role has been driven by such a logic. Started in 1990s through mid to late 2000s. If we look at Beijing's approach, initial response to Russia's proposal back in 1996, the proposal of forming a Russia-China-India strategic triangle, Beijing's initial response to the proposal was pretty cool, if not quite resistant. Because Russia's proposal was intended to hedge against to counterbalance a U.S. unipolarity world in post-Cold War era. But the turning point came in 1998 and 1999 because Beijing was outraged with India's use of China threats to justify India's nuclear test back in 1998 in India's prime minister's letter sent to the U.S. President Bill Clinton. It talks about it cited precisely the country in still have territorial disputes with India, possess nuclear weapons that makes it imperative for India to gain nuclear weapons. So China was launched a international diplomatic campaign to mobilize international sanctions against India. But for Russia was quite silent at the time and actually signed a 10-year defense agreement with India. So Beijing was actually really unhappy about Russia's approach. And so if you look at Chinese scholars' writings at the time, they talk about it openly. They talk about Russia doesn't need to worry about providing a large quantity of advanced weapons and military technology to India will threaten Russia's own security because Russia is not doesn't share the same border with India, but China does, which is a dispute. But Beijing quickly changed its position from 1999 onward. A primary driver was NATO bombing of Yugoslavia. Now Xi Jinping is currently in Serbia, and precisely timed with the 25th anniversary of the bombing of Chinese embassy in Belgrade. So it's all dialed back to to the events back to those days. So Beijing was so anxious and alarmed by the U.S. Unipolarity that Russia had been put out and talking about in rationalizing the strategic triangle concept. So they began to embrace the idea of the strategic triangle as a way to counter U.S. unipolarity and to prevent India from aligning with the U.S. to counterbalance China, which became more obvious under George W. Bush administration, which lifted the sanctions imposed after the nuclear tests and also start providing civil nuclear technology to India, starting in mid 2000, around 2005, 2006. So still, the Chinese were actually still need to put up their dissatisfaction with Russia, especially in Russia's arms sale to India. If you look at even PLA scholars' writings are not so implicit or indirect. They're very straightforward in writing. Like for example, one scholar at the PLA Nanjing Political College in an article in 2001 talk about Russia often sells a larger variety and quantity of weapons to India, and for a particular weapon system that Russia exports to both China and India, it is transferred to India ahead of China, and the version provided to India is often more advanced than that made for China. So when I saw that article, I tried to do some double check and fact check, and I utilized the CIPRI International Arms Transfer data set. And if you look at the data in terms of, I used the fighters and armors, which are important in a land confrontation, which seems to be the case, and also a often cited example of the Chinese talking about different versions provided to China and India is the Su-30 fighter jets that have been provided to both countries, but they are different versions. The version provided to India, the Su-30 MKI version, is has more advanced tech specifics and configurations and better combat effectiveness as compared to the version Su-30 MKK version provided to China. That is the often cited example. So what the Chinese complaint is have strong data support, but still the Chinese decide to put up with that, as explained. By another scholar, another India expert at Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences in 27 article, that the United States has increasingly talked about the need of India and Russia to keep check on the United States in the region. So basically, Hu Zhiyong talk about the U.S. has increasingly realized the value of India in South Asia, and thus is attempting to transform India into a new partner to keep the power balance in Asia in face of a rising China. But developments in Indo-Russian ties have to some extent prevented the U.S. advance into South Asia. That is 2007. So in terms of timing, it's perfect time, with the developments under the George W. Bush administration. And fast forward to the most recent decade after the Crimea crisis in 2014 and up to now. So another more prominent example that stands out that mentioned, that China has been dissatisfied in Russia's differentiated treatment between China and Russia is the issue, the sale of the S-400 missile defense system, the surface air missile system. So here's the problem is the China and Russia signed a deal in 2014, and after 2 regiments, China wants to purchase 4 to 6 regiments of that system, and 2 regiments were delivered between 2018 to 2019. But the delivery of the remaining units were suspended, and Russia says, oh, it's because the COVID problem that delayed the delivery of the rest, the remaining units. But China, if you look at India, Russia, they signed a deal in 2018, and 3 regiments were delivered to India between 2021 and 2023. So obviously, the COVID kind of like contradicted with the COVID reason that Russia has provided to China. And the delivered regiments have already been deployed to the Sino-Indian border region that really bolster India's capabilities vis-a-vis the Chinese. And also Moscow persuaded, kind of convinced China to agree to India's accession to the China-led Shanghai Cooperation Organization in 2017. Again, the rationale is, China decided to put up not to pressure Moscow to either reduce, to slow, or to cut the deal, to terminate the S-400 deal with India, and also agree to Moscow's lobby of letting India into the SCO, all driven by the rationale of choosing lesser of 2 evil. Because as we see in more recent PLA scholars and also Chinese think tanks analysts writing, for example, the 2017 article by a scholar at the PLA's Institute of International Relations, Nanjing, talks about as rapidly rising power, India would be an indispensable component in China's management of great power relations. So advancing the China-Russia-India triangle will significantly help China reduce the strategic pressure it faces in the Western Pacific, and China needs this strategic triangle more than the other 2 countries. That is back to 2017, and even more recently, the scholars at the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations, KICR, is one of the most influential and prestigious think tank in China under the Ministry of State Security, explicitly talk about a growing divergence between Russia and India would inevitably lead the latter to lean more closely to the US and the allies, thus bolstering America's efforts to reinforce its hegemony while increasing geopolitical pressure on Russia and China. So it's all driven by this, the Chinese would argue that, the Russia's arms sale and its backing for India has at some point contradicts with China's national interest, but that is the secondary national interest. At some point, it might be a price that China needs to pay to make sure, to help Russia to sweeten up the deal and strengthen its tie with India, and to deal with primary strategic concern, that is, the strategic pressure from the United States. Now switch to the Sino-Vietnam maritime disputes. And in this case, I'd argue that China has been a strong binder vis-a-vis Vietnam, because if we look at accommodative binding aspect, China has strong political reward power vis-a-vis vis-a-vis Vietnam, because China has been Vietnam's major ideological ally during the post-Cold War, and both countries has increasingly demonstrated that their share of the apprehension of a potential color revolution in their respective countries, and regime security in both countries come first and foremost on the mind of the leaders in both countries. And also China for those who pay attention to China-Vietnam relations, would recall from last year, Xi Jinping made a visit to Vietnam, and in the joint statement coming out of that trip, talking about China would provide more of internal security aid to Vietnam, such as intelligence sharing, and also China's experience in preventing the so-called color revolution. So in terms of political reward power, China does have this kind of rewards that Vietnam exactly needs. And in the economic aspect, China also has strong economic reward power with Vietnam as compared to the case of India-China relations. So China ranked Vietnam's 7th largest source of FDI as of 2021, and has been Vietnam's top trading partner since mid 2000s. And Vietnam is also deeply enmeshed in China-led regional economic institutions, including BRI and RCEP. And in terms of coercive bidding, precisely because China has so much reward power, both in political and economic terms, China can use this kind of reward power in a coercive way simply by withholding or cutting this kind of rewards, right? Carrots can be used as sticks simply by withholding or cutting the carrots, right? And also by imposing additional sanctions on Vietnam as well. So in this case, China really doesn't need Russia that much to help neutralize Vietnam. So Russia offers quite limited value in this regard. So under this circumstance, China's approach to Russia would be selective pressuring Russia's joint energy ventures with Vietnam that China sees as overlapping with Beijing's claimed areas as marked by the 9-dash line, or now is the 10-dash line. Before China's selective pressuring campaign on Russia was not observed before the 2012, probably because Russia did not actually foray into blocks within the 10-dash lines until after 2008, 2009, when China pressured other international oil companies to drop or to cease to terminate their operations in Vietnam. So starting from 2012, we begin to see some signs of Chinese selective pressure or even backlash against Russian energy companies' operation in South China Sea with Vietnam. So one first initial case is a 2012 a very rare open media backlash against Gazprom, one of Russia's major energy company. Gazprom's joint venture with Petro Vietnam to develop 2 blocks, both of which located within the 10-dash line. But that media backlash offers certain level of plausible deniability because the media backlash was issued through the Hong Kong-based Phoenix TV, which is backed by Beijing, but officially not part of the Chinese state media. So that allows China to say, oh, it's the Hong Kong media, right? But this sort of deniability, right? To deny is a direct backlash from Chinese state media. But still, given its Beijing backing background, you can tell it's kind of a open backlash against Russia, calling this 2012 deal as a political sellout of Russia's Chinese friend. And a more prominent, a clearer case happened more recently in 2019. When China and Vietnam were involved in a 4-month standoff in Vanguard Bank surrounding a Rosneft contracted drilling rig in a block near that area. And Rosneft is another Russian energy company operating with joint ventures operations with Vietnam. So during this standoff, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi requested in person to his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov to ask Russia to terminate its exploration activities in the South China Sea. And some information shows that China did tone down its exploration activity in the South China Sea after 2019, some kind indicating some kind of link to the Chinese pressure. And again, in 2023, there's another face-off, although a briefer one, between China and Vietnam near gas fields operated by Zarubezhneft, another Russian energy company. So here's a summary of all the projects that Russian energy companies have been involved in Vietnam in blocks that overlap or completely fall within the 10-dash line. So that traces the timeline of Chinese pressuring on Russia, and that matches what I observe and argue in my paper. And also, it seems that although the Chinese literature didn't specifically talk about that, but it also seems that by pressuring Russia's joint energy venture on with Vietnam, is also kind of intended as a strategy of killing two birds with one stone, because that also can weaken Vietnam's financial resources financial sources for arm procurement from Russia, because back in the early 2000s, the Russian-Vietnam joint energy ventures is really a major source for Vietnam to earn hard currency. It accounts for like 20% or so for Vietnam's hard currency back at that time. It might decline a little bit now, but still it's important for Vietnam. And Russia and Vietnam's defense ties also compound China's concerns about Russia's involvement in the South China Sea. In most cited case is the sale of 6 Kilo-class diesel-powered attack submarines that Russia sold to Vietnam in 2009, and these submarines were also equipped with both anti-ship missiles and land attack cruise missiles were provided to Vietnam. So this submarine fleet provided Vietnam with a credible, although kind of modest, anti-access area denial capabilities against Chinese vessels operating in the South China Sea. And also the missiles equipped on those submarines gave Vietnam the capability to threaten China's onshore facilities on the land features China has controlled and developed in the South China Sea, and some Chinese literature would even say that these capabilities can threaten the facilities in Hainan province. But by contrast, if we look at the SPRI database data set, Russia has only provided one type of the anti-ship missile. The one comes with shorter range to China, although Russia sold both, Russia also sold the Kilo-class submarine to China as well. But the missiles that it come equipped come on that submarines is only one type of the missiles that come with shorter range. So the rationale of pressuring the Russia-Vietnamese joint venture in South China Sea kind of the Chinese scholar talking about this kind of venture raise the cost for China to defend its maritime rights and interests by enable Vietnam to purchase more advanced weapon systems from Russia and embolden Vietnam to challenge China and thereby raise the cost. So that's how come you can kind of infer that China does see some strategic value in pressuring the Russian-Vietnam joint ventures, not only for economic reason, but also for a strategic reason in the South China Sea. Now, I think I'm running out of time. Let me quickly wrap up the policy implications. So I think to sum it up, this study shows that the Sino-Russian power asymmetry that on the surface favoring China does not necessarily translate into a corresponding increase in Beijing's leverage over Moscow across the board. And it also shows that China-Russian relations contain elements that could lead to its constraining and weakening, if not ultimate unraveling. And the purportedly no-limit Sino-Russian alignment does have limits and divergent interests when it comes to China's long-standing territorial disputes with India and Vietnam. And also it has implications for US Indo-Pacific strategy, because the US approach of consistent confrontation and pressuring based on the assumption that Russia and China are a so-called autocratic alliance may be counterproductive by driving the two countries further closer together. And alternatively, the United States can actively expose China-Russia discrepancies and recalibrates its China strategy to pry them apart. As evidenced in one of leading Russia scholars at Kicker, that the Chinese know clear that the Sino-Russian strategic partnership, driven primarily by a shared external threat, is inherently temporary, uncertain, fragile, and susceptible to destabilization with even a slight change in the external pressure. And lastly, with respect to India and Vietnam, I think Washington should approach the issue of whether to apply kata, the counter America's adversary through Sanction Act, its 2017 Act, should approach this issue with a clear recognition that compelling the two countries to sever or to weaken their ties with Russia would unintentionally eliminate a longstanding source of discord between Beijing and Moscow. So I'll stop here since it's still a working paper. I think any comments and suggestions would be truly helpful and appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Shuxian. That was great. Very informative and up to date, and we look forward to your completing the paper. Let me let's chat is now open, and for people who want to submit questions. I know that Shushan is on a very limited time schedule here in Manila. She has a busy day ahead of her, and it's still
Largely thanks to the traffic situation here.
I guess one of the questions that come up is that Xi Jinping was in India recently, I think, and the
India?
relationship. Well, I take that back. I think I must have been reading. I read something in the New York Times, which about the Modi government and Xi Jinping. I may have misunderstood. Uh, of course, Xi Jinping is currently in Hungary visiting his friend Viktor Orban. Uh, does that figure into all of this relationship with Russia?
I think it comes at least, the baseline assessment is um, it might be intended to, to showcase China's intention to repair its relations with Europe, especially, which have been particularly tarnished in the shadow of the war in Ukraine because of China's unlimited, no limit relation alignment with Russia, and also China's rejection of come out explicitly criticizing Russia's invasion of Ukraine that really tarnished, China-Europe relations. And China also announced the extension of visa-free visit for, several major European countries, also as kind of, sign of, kind of signaling that China's intention of repairing some relations with Europe, given, the importance of economic importance of Europe to China. I think that is the major at least one of the major goals that I think signal a message that Xi Jinping is trying to send out to Europe. I'm not sure like how Russia. Definitely they will talk about Russia. Talk about the war in Ukraine, and also I think the Gaza is another issue that China has been trying to like win over more. More I won't call ally, win over more more European countries or drive a wedge between some U.S. European allies like France and the United States with regard to Gaza. But that's might not be so directly related to Russia, but definitely I think the China-Russia relations, especially the recent information about China's continued provision of support for military for Russia's military compound has been quite a focal point in discussion.
We have a question. What is the role of Sino-Pakistani special relationship vis-a-vis the China-Russia-India triangle?
I didn't look at my paper. Didn't particularly look at the China-Pakistan relations, but that's obviously another another concern weighing on on India have been hindering China India relations. And also if you look at Vajpayee's letter to Bill Clinton justifying India's nuclear tests, China's support for Pakistan's nuclear program had been also been cited as a major justification for India's pursuit of nuclear weapons. That's definitely part of calculation.
Here's another question. What also is the importance of land in China foreign policy? In Mao's period, China made land border deals with Burma and Vietnam, but under Xi, it seems China is insisting on sovereignty over small bits of land in the Himalayas and the Philippine EEZ, despite enormous foreign policy and political costs.
I think there are two different types of land we're talking about because I want to separate, land border disputes with, from maritime to territorial and boundary disputes because they come with different dynamic and rationale. And we have seen that China has a track record of being more willing to settle land border disputes. And I think in the case of, China-India land border disputes, China had been willing to talk about the package deal until up to like 1980s. But that was, I think, according to John Garver, a real expert on China-India relations, China stopped talking about the package deal sometime after 1980s, but way before Xi Jinping come into power because the Chinese know that the package deal, the swap deal definitely won't be accepted by Indians. So now they would insist on the sector by sector approach. But I think China's demand in the sticking point in the eastern sector is a place where the Dalai Lama was born, and some kind of religious importance was attached to that. So, in terms of, in that regard, China definitely doesn't want definitely doesn't want the place go to India. That would make Dalai Lama looks as a, as born in on Indian territory, right? That's something China would be acceptable to China. I don't think it's completely land issue, but also some political issue that's closely related to Tibet and also Dalai Lama as well. And for maritime disputes, I don't think China has a track record of being willing to make as many compromises and concessions as it had been doing in land border disputes. I would argue it's both because of in maritime disputes, land a piece of land, a small rock or a small island is not just about land. It's also about the maritime, the sea areas and the maritime resources in that area, in the adjacent area that comes with the land, right? It could be for a rock, it's 12 nautical miles, high tide elevation is 12 nautical miles, territorial sea, and for an island, as defined on the UNCLOS, is territorial sea, contiguous zone, and a full 200 nautical miles EEZ. So in the maritime disputes, so I would argue that's a major reason that makes maritime disputes more difficult to settle. So because it entails not only just the land, and also when you think about some land like the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands dispute between China and Japan, it also comes with the notion of indivisibility, or the notion of the disputed territories being integrated, being socialized by populations to become a narrative that's related to national identity and other more ideational issues that closely intertwine with that kind of narrative. I hope that makes sense, because the territorial indivisibility has really made territorial disputes a protracted source of enduring source of protracted conflict in countries, not just between China and and its neighbors, but also for other countries around the world. If you take a look at the data.
Well, along those lines, how does North Korea come into the Russia-China relationship? Does Russia need North Koreans more than China?
I think Russia is, well, my personal understanding, because I didn't particularly look at North Korea's role in this paper or in the project, but I'll it's a different project I will work on. But I think there had been some excellent work done by other scholars like Oriana Skylar Mastral at Stanford University. She had an excellent piece on foreign affairs just a few weeks ago, I think, talking about Russia and North Korea buying together, but might kind of like kind of want to send a message to Beijing. But the thing is, Beijing is not so happy in seeing, North Korea and Russia coming together because that might, lead to weakened that might weaken China's leverage vis-a-vis both countries, and make things maybe beyond what China would want to control.
I have a question from Ray Burkhart. Ray,
Hi.
I'll let Ray ask the question. Ray is a former ambassador to Vietnam, so I'll let him ask the question directly. Go ahead, Ray.
Hi, I just wanted to, if you could elaborate a bit on how China has used Russia and whether there's been any successful use of Russia and to put pressure on Vietnam. For example, Vietnam depends very much on military parts from Russia. I haven't seen any indication that it's ever sort of held back on that. It's a good business for Russia. And Vietnam has shown some interest in perhaps moving toward using more American military equipment. So has Russia been useful or helpful in any way, and particularly on the maritime issues? Russia continues to, I believe Russia continues to be one of the countries that extracts oil from the waters off Vietnam. I don't know whether those are waters that China still claims. They probably are. So, but I don't think China has any difficulty with put any pressure on Russia to withdraw its oil extraction work from the Vietnamese waters. I don't think.
Thank you for the question, Ray. And first, let me start with the arms sale. Did China use or put any pressure on Russia with respect to arms sale? I think a baseline here is Russian arms sale to Vietnam has, both in terms of scale and in terms of the level of technology transfer, has been much, much lower than the Russians' transfer to India. Because if you look at separate database, there have been, quite a lot of a great variety of products that Russia and before Russia and Soviet Union had allowed India to produce with a license and even have a joint venture. But this level of technology transfer has been much lower, and also in terms of quantity and variety of weapons, Vietnam has received from Vietnam that's of much, much smaller scale. I think maybe because of the difference in scale and level of technology transfer, China might not see Russian arms deal with Vietnam as threatening as Russian defense cooperation with India. And also, like I said, I don't think China sees Russia as useful in pressuring Vietnam directly, because, like I mentioned, China itself has been a strong binder. It can use its own power, political power, economic power to pressure Vietnam. So in other words, China has a broad set of policy instruments to achieve its foreign policy goal without having to, rely on Russia. That's a different case from India. But at some point, from time to time, like in 2016, after the South China Sea arbitration ruling came out, Russia, came out and say it doesn't, the ruling is invalid, sided with taking China's talking point. And also, Russia and China has conducted joint military exercise in South China Sea. If we look at CSIS, China-Russia Joint Military Exercise Database, a data set, they have joint exercise in the East China Sea, in the South China Sea, and in other parts in Xinjiang. But they have stayed away from Tibet and stay away from the disputed border between China and India. That's also something I would argue that China doesn't want to push Russia to take a clear stand between China and India, because Russia's tie with India is more useful to keep India completely leaning toward the United States. And with respect to the hydrocarbon resource ENP exploration and production, yes, I think there are, Russian operations outside of the disputed area. So that's that might be less problematic, much closer to Vietnam's coast. That might not be a problem for China. And also we need to distinguish between exploration activities from production activities at pre-existing facilities, because from what I learned is the major point of issue that China has with respect to Russia-Vietnam joint venture is exploration activity. That is to find new sources for production and new sites for production. But that's the part that it seems to me that China has been targeting on. But for pre-existing facilities that's already in operation in production, I think they have continued even after 2019. I think the part of Russian activities that have been impacted by Chinese pressure is the exploration part. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you, Shuxian. I we have a lot more questions, but I know you're on a very tight schedule in Manila, and I appreciate your taking the time to do this talk for us.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed the
Thank you
discussion.
very much, and I know you have a long day ahead of you. Good luck to you on your field work.
Thank you. Have a good one.